who I've met many times and working online. To me, I am a lawyer, and this is always like coming home to my neck. It feels like there's much done, and the needs to the glad to have the languages from the perspective of the court is very different from what we're doing in the past. People first, I want to pay homage to the role of lawyers in MEA and multilateral environment agreements. The CMS, National Migratory Species, was born by the work of two pioneers in the law area, being Francis and Wolfgang Verheyen. And Francis is actually the head of the IUCN Law Center. CMS life was instrumental not just for CMS, but societies and other international laws or MEAs that were born in Stockholm in the 1972 Stockholm meeting, which really was a watershed moment for international law as we know today. The CMS was born after that, or was finalized after that, and CMS reflects really the core principles that were adopted at Stockholm, which are that we need to have countries who come together to agree on international measures to protect the environment and conserve species when actions by one country alone are not sufficient. And in the case of migratory species that move across national borders, is where our work is done, they have to work together, because if you only do actions at home, it will not accomplish what you need to do to conserve those species. So today, national migratory species has grown to 133 countries around the world. And in addition, about between 30 and 40, I have to actually check our numbers of members of other countries that are members to a specific instrument as part of a suite of treaties and binding and non-binding instruments that we have under CMS. For example, we have a binding agreement for the African Eurasian waterbirds, so the regional agreement. We also have what's called an MOU on sharks, which is global. And I'll note that the United States is in fact a party or signatory to the Sharks MOU, even though they're not a part of the CMS. So we can see how that works. We expand our work that way. So in a nutshell, what we are doing is really providing unique and effective platforms to bring together all the main states, all the countries that used to come together to agree on a common conservation plan and setting priorities together. And that's what
yeah. Now, turning to the Global Biodiversity Framework, I have to say that I find, with certainly some exceptions, but that overall the negotiation of the GBF has been actually missing lawyers. And when I see the delegates at the table, because I know many of them, and many of them are excellent in their field and they know this stuff, they've been coming to these meetings, but lawyers have a particular role to play. And so I'm thinking, well, why is that? And maybe that's part of the problem or one of the challenges. So first, I would say that, lawyers, and I did work for 6 years in law firms before I paid off my dues and then got to work for the government. And what you realize when you do that, I did corporate law, is first you agree on the deal and then you put it into words. That's how it works. You have to have an agreement of the principles. What are we trying to accomplish? And then you try to see how to reflect that best in words. What's happened with the GBF is a bit of the opposite. It started with words. And what's a bit hard, and I actually was feeling sort of emotional today, was that I feel like we're failing because what's coming out of it are words that don't mean the same to everyone. Okay, and what's being negotiated is to make sure that those words work for each country so that when they go home, they can live with those words, as opposed to saying, here are the words we need to agree on what are the priorities for actually turning around this biodiversity crisis. So this is a huge sort of epiphany I had this morning, and it's really troubling me, but I have Yvonne gave me a good reminder, which will help me end on a very positive note. The second is, when are lawyers at the table? They are at the table when binding agreements are negotiated, when the negotiated text needs to be precise, when the agreement is binding, and you see that, for example, in some other arenas like business, trade agreements, but in the environment, as we know, and in the MEAs, it's often not binding. It's softer. And that does bring to mind this hierarchy in our socio-economic system of what matters. And so why is it that the environment agreements are not binding? In fact, in the negotiations, one of the countries actually wanted to put language in there yesterday that said, this is not binding. And I think that won't stay in, but it's still the truth, even if it's not stated. And then the third, I want to recognize, since today is International Human Rights Day, I actually was very lucky to hear some words from the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zayed bin Raad from Jordan. And he has had an illustrious career talking about multilateralism and the values of the UN. And he said, you know, we've lost our way a bit because the original ideas and the ideas of Stockholm and the founding of the UN was that we come together for a common purpose. But as I alluded to earlier, really it's become for many countries making sure their national interests are achieved. So it's not about multilateralism, it's about national interest. And again, that's not going to get us to where we need to go. Okay, so having said all that, there is therefore a lot of work to do, a lot of room for lawyers to get to work on making sure that whatever the words are that are adopted by the GBF, that we make them have meaning and make them at the national level and at other regional levels, global levels, actually have an impact. So what are some areas? I'll just name three. First, many, if not all, of the GBF goals and targets have elements in which law needs to play a role, key role. I'll give you three quick targets. Target one on spatial planning. Spatial planning, it's a huge tool. It's about zoning. It's about saying what can go in one area, what can go in another. Can we do business there? Can we do agriculture, mining? Or do we have to protect these ecosystems in a connected way? We need laws that ensure that. It's very simple. And enforcing it. Second, I'll jump to target 14. Target 14 is about mainstreaming. So what are the impacts of agriculture, food systems, manufacturing, infrastructure on the environment, and how do we ensure that those impacts are avoided or minimized and that the hierarchy for infrastructure is adhered to, and that mitigation measures are actually carried out, which often they are not. So this is about integrating environmental values, biodiversity into strategic environmental assessment, environmental impact assessment, but also outside the safeguards realm into investment. You know, how are we making sure that we're investing in the right things that don't, that keep the balance between our environmental needs and our economic and social needs. Finally, on the targets, I have to mention, of course, target 5. So target 5 is about ensuring that the harvesting, use, and trade, whether it's international trade or domestic trade, is safe, is legal, and is sustainable. But as I said, those words are not defined. And so we need to make sure that those words are understood at the national level and that there are good measures and indicators to implement them. And some of those have to do with laws. So what do countries have laws to ensure that? Do they have regulations? Do they have a permitting system for legal hunting? Are they complying with it? Are there enforcement measures? Are they penalized in the courts if they're not abiding by those laws? And are those penalties sufficient to deter crime? So there's a huge area, and Yvonne, of course, works deeply in this space as well. So the last point I'll make on this in terms of lawyers and what we can do is bringing it back to CMS. And this is the point of optimism that Yvonne gave me, which is CBD is a very large, some people call it a framework agreement, much like the climate agreement. And CMS and CITES and a number of other biodiversity agreements are much more focused on pragmatic, specific issues. So we do work much more on the ground. We do work with countries on a national level, transboundary level, regional level, to implement common goals. So the answer actually, and I feel the optimism of I can go back home and focus on my main job, which is to implement effectively and help countries to implement with stakeholders the Convention on Migratory Species for the Conservation of Wild Species that migrate is the best way to think of what we do. So I hope you will all take up that mantle because we need your help, whether it's from academia or in a law firm or anywhere that you are in your career. And I hope we can continue to work, of course, together with those involved with the work of this larger group in implementing it from the lawyer's perspective. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And Amy was, of course, one of the inspiring forces behind the founding of the Biodiversity Law and Governance Initiative when she worked on the SDGs, bringing together the commitments and the Aichi targets into the SDGs and vice versa.
Feeling my gray hairs.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, James, I know that you've been asked to bring forward some of the work on finance that is being done, and then we will close looking at implementation, enforcement, innovations, which CITES have done well. So if you don't mind, maybe just 5 or 6 minutes.
Okay, well, thanks, Mary Claire, Amy, and everyone. Thanks for being on the panel. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm not used to talking to a room full of lawyers. It's not necessarily my comfort zone, but I actually really echo what Amy said. Is there are not enough legal voices in these negotiations in particular. And I was listening to the Target 3 negotiation last night until midnight, and of course, IUCN, we have our position, and we're working with all our members. So we have state members, we have NGO non-governmental members, and we have a whole range of expertise we can draw on, including legal, which I think we could do a lot more of. But I'm listening to a debate about the word governance, and should it stay in or not? And it's like, okay, this is where we are, So it's word to word, and exactly as Amy said, it's countries there's a lot of positioning. It's politics, and I think one mistake we make is we assume that this is a technical document, that this is based on science and based on all the best available knowledge to input it, and it's not. It's a negotiation, and what comes out is a political statement. And it's our job to then run off and say, right, well, that was fun, that was great. Now we've got this text. What can we do with it? How can we turn this into something that is useful internationally across borders, but also more specifically within countries? I work quite a lot with different countries, different members, our different offices, different places. Vietnam was one that got mentioned. The delegation this year, Vietnam, actually, this is a good point. I'm seeing more countries that are not usually vocal or active or participating in global negotiations are actually taking it more seriously. And there's more interest in being aware of what is being negotiated, what are the implications. Maybe that actually speaks a bit to what Amy was saying about the increase in the kind of the national interest. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe countries are actually saying, hold on a minute, this global agreement would mean something for us. We better be at the table, we better be seeing what's happening. But previously, you would have a delegate at a lot of the smaller meetings. A delegate would be sent, they would not necessarily have the full support. There's maybe 1 or 2 delegates from many countries compared to other countries who have 20 or 30. They have to be briefed on every single one of the topics, and was it 23 targets now? So you need to speak to as one delegate. So quite often they go home and then they go to whichever Ministry of Environment normally, and they say, well, what happened? They're like, well, I don't know, here's some decisions, and this is what we have. Ministry of Environment then communicates that to other ministries like agriculture, or the important ones like finance. And they say, so what does all this mean? And it just gets lost. So actually the ability of countries to bring back the good things in these agreements and translate it into very, very practical steps that they can take at a national level is we assume it happens, but it doesn't always happen. And that's one thing we're working on. So my focus is really on protected and conserved areas, area-based conservation in all shapes and forms, and that includes any type of thing that I could challenge you to come up with. Does that count as a conservation unit? Yes, it does. If it's delivering something for biodiversity, for climate, for people, for equity, for these things, then it's pretty good, and we should be looking at how we can support those, and it should be included in this framework in the targets, especially the target 3. The 30%, I'll get onto financing in a second. I was just ripping it here. 30% is our organization is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. We have that as one of our resolutions, which means it's passed by all our members. So all 140 state members, all the 1,400 plus organizations that are part of our union. And the resolution on 30% is that is the minimum that we require to kind of stave the biodiversity and climate crises. And that 30% is not just, you know, then we forget about the other 70%. That 30% is really effectively conserved. It is fairly and effectively managed for ecosystem biodiversity outcomes. It's not just something, yeah, put some things in here and forget about it. It has to really be effective. So actually the focus of all our efforts is on effectiveness. It's not on the target, 30%, 20%, 40%, whatever, that's fine. And that target is actually global. So different countries could take on what they can, but there's not an absolute agreement here that every country should deliver 30%. But what we are seeing is many countries are committing to expand the area that they have under protected areas, conserved areas. And there are commitments towards making those areas more effective. And that's where our work as IUCN, we have our standards for what is an effective area-based conservation unit. What does it look like? There's never really been a standard before. There's lots of assessment tools and methodologies and things you can look at. You know, do you have a management plan? Do you have people involved in different elements? But we've come up with a standard that has been approved by all our members, and it's called the IUCN Green List, simply because we have a red list. This is a green one, and it's, you know, it just works. The green list is 4 major elements that come into the standard, and you'd think the first one would be, you know, effective management, or, you know, design and planning for biodiversity, or measuring conservation outcomes. They're actually 2, 3, and 4. The first one is good governance, and everything starts with good governance. If anyone says, you know, how can we, you know, management effectiveness, and it's good governance, that is the key. Everywhere across the world where you see an effective protected area or conserved area that's delivering for people, delivering for nature, it's because the governance arrangements are right. And who helps with the governance? Who is really good at governance and getting governance frameworks and things put in and reflected in policy? It's you guys. So there's a huge role for you to play as lawyers, environmental lawyers. We're hearing about you know, all sorts of innovations in the legal world, recognizing rivers in New Zealand. There's the Earth Law Center here in California pushing, you know, rights in Ecuador that recognize rights of living things, and, you know, to be legally represented. But then we get to the financing. So I'm just going to kind of switch in a major way. We had an event yesterday. I'm not a finance person. I'm not a banker. I know what money is, and I'm good at spending it. But I also know from working in the field, in different places, in different countries. I'm looking at Pascal from DRC. You need financing. You can't do things without resources. There's only a certain level you can get to without the resources. But money in itself is not a determinant of success. It's money plus governance. It's the efficient and effective use of resources in a fair way that helps advance people's interests, and they come together to do something. That's what it's about. So, you know, quite often it's like, you know, we need, you know, an extra 10 billion per year to save the planet. It's like, no, you need an extra 10 billion, and you need to really look at the governance of those funds to make sure they're reaching the right places with the right people, with the right decision-making framework for them to do the things they need to do. So with that hat on, we've been working with different countries. I'm going to just mention Uzbekistan. And one reason for Uzbekistan is they are hosting the next CMS COP next year in October. So that's like 10 months to maybe bring some of the implementation from this convention. We've got some time and a few countries to actually show the shift to implementation. But Uzbekistan have a commitment to expand their protected area network. So the total area of land under effective area-based conservation to 12% of their land area by 2028. And that's at least 2 or 3, I think 3 million hectares already been established, and maybe another million more as well. That's not just in protected areas, they're also looking at how can they diversify the governance kind of arrangements that could support good area-based conservation. So it doesn't just have to be a national park. It doesn't just have to be a nature reserve. There's so many other kind of ways to manage lands and to recognize effective conservation. So one of the reasons that they're kind of asking us for help, and they're looking at, they've been quite innovative, is that if you want to expand a public system of area-based conservation, then you need to have an investment to do that. It's going to cost a lot. If you're adding 3 million hectares, if you're essentially doubling your area under management, then you need to double the budget that it's going to take to do that. So part of the interest in these kind of innovations in governance is also like, can we bring new resources to the table, new additional resources? So Uzbekistan is looking at sustainability-linked bond, so a sovereign bond where the country is interested in the outcome, but would put the outcome out to outcome buyers to then help deliver that outcome, and then the payment is done. So it's kind of it's a bond mechanism. Uzbekistan piloted the first Sustainable Development Goal bond, and they've issued 2 or 3 bonds already linked to that. So the idea is that looking at Chile, looking at Uruguay, looking at other countries who've really been innovating around large-scale financing mechanisms for environment and climate, for reforestation. Could there be a bond for biodiversity? So potentially in Uzbekistan, then they could be the first system-level, country-level financing mechanism to support the expansion of protected areas. But what's really important for us is that that financing mechanism and the key performance indicators speak to the quality of those areas. So it's not just that you invest and you establish areas and then you just leave them, but it really should be based over time. The outcome is on effective delivery of conservation, effective engagement of local people, local actors, that the governance is supported. And this is where some of the discussion we had yesterday, and where the lawyers can really help, is structuring these things. The banking, they can structure this in 5 minutes. What they can't do is make sure that the mechanism will channel those resources to these small areas, to the different actors, the whole mechanism for turning that finance into effectiveness. And that you have key performance indicators that are not just easy to quantify, such as the area on a map or the number of hectares of forest, but actually around some of the qualitative measures on the robustness of the governance, guaranteeing legitimacy and voice, transparency, accountability, engagement of rights holders, reducing legacy issues. There's a whole basket of things in there which could be included into these financing mechanisms, but would need some clever structuring to help them happen. So I think I'll just leave it there because of the time, but that was a bit of a shifted basket of issues. But essentially, effective area-based conservation needs resources, and those resources rely on the governance, and you guys can really help with, in different countries around the world and globally on supporting what does good governance look like for area-based conservation. Thank you.
So last but certainly not least, I understand actually that the order is sort of meant to go in inverse. So you can consider yourself our most important speaker at the moment. I think Amy will give you that. She's having a good day. We are looking at how to advance the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework by scaling up law and governance capacity, practice, and reform. Amy has given us some very, very good initial starting points, particularly in terms of implementing on the ground the migratory species arrangements under the CMS. And from an IUCN perspective, James has been very kind by putting forward not just the conservation vision, but also some of the innovative financial forms and where law and governance capacity is needed. There is no other treaty that is better known for its binding enforcement mechanisms and for its work on law than CITES. Anyone who's been incredibly generous to join us, Higuero, who is of course Secretary General of CITES, to speak about this today.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak here amongst, I think, all of us are the most important speakers who are sitting around the table, because we all have our different perspectives, and it's true that these legally binding agreements are similar in this fact that we're dealing with biodiversity, we're both dealing with lost species. But one of the things that I admire a lot about CMS is the biggest threat to right now to the survival of species and to biodiversity is habitat loss, habitat fragmentation. And this is really the focus of CMS. And we don't see, talking about finances, my favorite subject as an economist, we don't see the financing going in that direction. We don't see the political will going in that direction of How can we solve this problem about habitat loss, which is again, number one, but of course, overexploitation of species is another threat that is huge, and we need to address that as well. But just allow me 2 minutes about or 1 minute about financing. Excuse me, I think we have to change our mindset, because we have been all this time thinking about providing money to those mega diverse countries and doing projects and all of this, as if somehow this is, part of the overseas development. It should be part of overseas development assistance, but that mindset, I think, has kept us back. We are talking payment for ecosystem services. We are talking payment for those conservation services that these countries are doing. We want that wildlife to exist. We want those protected areas to exist because they give something back to the whole world. Globally, at the global level, we're all benefiting from these protected areas. We're all benefiting from this wildlife. But the conservation costs are at the local level. And we need to find ways, we need to find these innovative mechanisms. We need to talk more about, you're providing a service to us, and we need to pay for that service. And it's the same thing when we talk about local communities and indigenous people. They are providing a service. We're not helping them. They are providing a service to us by conserving those habitats, by conserving that wildlife. So thank you for permitting that little propaganda there about how I feel about these things, and really it requires a real change in the way we think about it. Now, on CITES and talking about governance and legal aspects, I mean, I'm not because I'm the Secretary General of CITES, but I think it is a unique convention, and many people have said there will be no other convention agreed in such a way where they have these compliance mechanisms, and where you have within the text of the convention is legally binding, where it is legally binding, whoever signs up to this have to do a number of things, the way the appendices work. We have appendix 1 through 3 that most of you know about. The next one where there can be no commercial trade. Appendix 2 where there can be commercial trade. 95% of the species that are under CITES can be commercially traded, but as long as it's regulated with a proper permit. Appendix 3 is a different type of appendix where parties are concerned about the trade in certain species, and they want to be checking to see what is happening and getting more data, and having other parties help them in checking what is happening with that trade. This is all embedded in the convention. The fact that you have to establish scientific authorities and management authorities is embedded in the convention. The fact that you have to have law, national law, that deals with wildlife and deals with wildlife trade is part of the legally binding aspect of the convention. We have Article 13 where there's compliance measures. If your trade is not properly regulated, if you're not having, and I'll talk a little bit about the basic documents of the convention, if you don't have these, you cannot be put a suspension on not only on the trade of that particular species, but on all CITES listed species that you may be trading in, if it is found that you are not complying with CITES. So all of these issues are part of embedded in the legal aspect of the convention. And two things that are very basic, which I think we need much more work by lawyers about legal acquisition findings. It's a document required to be able to do trade, where you have to make sure from the moment that you take that species, and it can be anything, it can be animal, plant, you have to know, was this legally acquired? And so you have to be able to prove that to be able to trade. And the second thing is a scientific document called non-detriment findings, which the parties have to have in order to trade with those species. So those are basic laws that have to be, basic studies that have to be embedded in the law to do. And the other, what you mentioned, is that there's this compliance mechanisms, that this is where also legally, in that national legislation that you do, you have to make sure that it's a crime if you are not, if there's, for example, anybody caught, any criminal caught legally and illegally trafficking in certain types of species should be punished. And what we're trying to do is to make sure it's not a small punishment, it's a big punishment. It's a crime equal to any other crime. So this is also what has to be in that legislation. We're pushing for higher level punishments for this. Now, what surprises me sometimes is that we don't pay enough attention, and I think this is where the target 5 of the Global Biodiversity Framework is very helpful, because we are talking about legality, sustainability, traceability. This is all representing those documents, those legal aspects of the convention. but I don't think we pay enough attention to them. We talk a lot about illegal trade, which we need to talk about, but it's a sexy thing, and a lot of money comes into that. And, you know, probably wrong to say that it's a sexy thing, but it's something that everybody wants to be involved in the legal trade. But very few are worried about compliance in the country, compliance with the legal aspects of CITES. We need to have institutions that are strong. Here's where we come with governance. We need institutions that are strong. We need to have the scientific and management authorities to build the capacity with these authorities. We need to ensure that they can carry out these non-detriment findings. We need to ensure it's very, very difficult. We have found that many are trading without having those non-detriment findings done. We are finding out that many are trading without having legal acquisition findings. So I think we need to pay much more attention to this. And this is why we have a compliance assistance program. And there again, with very few resources, when you think of the millions that are going into legal trade, very little is going into the compliance part of the convention and to this program. When we are working, for example, on capacity building for scientific authorities, for the management authorities, we have programs and projects dealing with these kinds of issues. Again, very little financing. So I would hope that this target 5 that comes out of the Global Biodiversity Framework will be strong enough that we will find that we will be investing more in this. Because if you can't apply the law, if you don't apply the law, first you have to create the national legislation, which we also support. You may be familiar. There's different categories. The parties are with different categories. I think we have now 80, 100, but maybe 80 parties that have our category A, but others that are lower. We need to work with them. We have a national legislation project. Again, asking for little amounts of money from different donors to be able to do this. Why? This is one of the most important things. Then we have to do the application law again. We need to make much more efforts to be able to put that in place. And finally, a little bit about we of course get a lot of information, which we need to do the monitoring and review. And one of the things about this Global Biodiversity Framework, I think, is what we should be focusing on, what the purpose of it should be. Over the years, it has been very difficult to show progress in halting the loss of biodiversity and in reversing the loss of biodiversity. It's really been very difficult for this sector of biodiversity to be able to say, are we progressing with the policies that we've put in place? Are we making a difference? Are we actually changing what we think in terms of these species extinctions, etc.? It's very hard. Other treaties are more successful, like the ozone treaty, because they can say, we can measure this. We can measure and we can see that we've made a difference. With climate change, you have a temperature you can measure. We are having difficulties doing that with biodiversity. And the public, you need a communication tool. You need something that's going to say, yes, we are doing all of this work and we're achieving something. And I really hope that we can come up with something that's not 200 pages long, but that will help us to be able to get that message across with the help of the different biodiversity conventions to be able to contribute to that. And then last but not least, I would like to talk a little bit about livelihoods, because it is about sustainable use. The wildlife trade is there. It exists, and we need to find ways to regulate it better. And it also helps with livelihoods. And when we talk about indigenous peoples and local communities, it is having an impact on them. If we, for example, and we have this in our resolutions of CITES, if, for example, there's a suspension of trade in something that can be overexploited, livelihoods should be taken into account. It's not the primary thing that our parties look at, because of course they're worried about conservation, and we should be worried about conservation, and we should put a suspension in place. However, what are the alternatives that could be offered to those local communities, to those indigenous people, when something like this happens? I don't think the governments do enough to think about that, to see what could be alternatives and how to help them. To me, the success of the convention is not about listing species. Yes, we have to list species, but that's not the success of the convention. The success of the convention is when those populations of species grow, and then you can remove it and move it from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2, and from Appendix 2, take it off the appendices, and it's perfectly safe now to be able to do this trade. We need to think of the convention in that way. That's the success of the convention, and therefore we need to think about these livelihoods, about the people who are living side by side with the wildlife, and how they are the guardians, and they are the ones guarding these habitats, and we need to be able to make sure that they are involved, participating in the decision making related to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Amazing, amazing words here today. Being a litigator by trade, I was senior counsel for Sierra Legal Defense Fund's EAGLE project, EAGLE being Environmental and Aboriginal Guardianship through Law and Education. And what we did is we litigated the environmental issues, but we used the sword of Indigenous rights to protect the environment. And I see another opportunity here because the EAGLE system no longer exists, unfortunately. Eco-justice no longer runs it. But it's possible that in Canada, at least, Indigenous Crown treaties can play a significant part in migratory species and habitat protection. And the reason why is treaties protect for Indigenous peoples the usufructuary use going on in the land, Crown land, and using the hunting, fishing, trapping, harvesting in a way that is respectful to the environment. So you've got that protected, and treaties in Canada are quasi-constitutional documents. So when you're in a fight against, for example, a corporation act or a provincial act or a federal act, and you square that against a treaty right, the treaty right will win. So if you look at that and you provide an alliance between environmental groups and First Nations in protecting the environment, in having the treaties speak for the environment to protect migratory species, protect habitat, because that is helping Indigenous peoples do their stewardship, which is what they do so well. So, and that is all part of a kind of a quasi-constitutional rights found in Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, which provide the protection of treaty rights. So realizing that good governance for Indigenous peoples is connected to habitat protection and migratory species protection through the exercise of their treaty right, through the protection of the environment, is an opportunity for an alliance between environmental organizations or other organizations that wish to fund the environmental protection through the use of the rights that exist, the quasi-constitutional rights that exist, can have a huge impact. I remember doing the litigation myself when we did this for coho salmon. We won an injunction against the Crown trying to do a sports fishing license against coho salmon, where they didn't consult with Indigenous peoples. I represented the Adams Lake and Muscogee peoples, the Secwepemc Nation, and we won based on the use of traditional knowledge of the stories of the use and stewardship of the fish to demonstrate that there is that right. And then there has been a failure to negotiate, a failure to consult, and that granted the injunction against the arbitrary use of a sports fishing license. So this kind of collaboration is quite useful. I think the eagle happened, God, it was what, 20 years ago, and it died because of lack of funding. But if we can resurrect the eagle, maybe he is a phoenix. This could be something really big. So thank you.
And I should say as well, Wayne, when I was called back to Canada, leaving the International Development Law Organization, I was asked to lead governance and stakeholder relations for Canada's newly resurrected environment and climate change ministry. And the colleagues from the Canadian Wildlife Service used to receive the writ that they were being sued for not protecting endangered species. And they would walk out of the office, they'd say, we've just got another case. And the scientists and the environmental experts and others around them from the department would gather around and they would say, this is the caribou, isn't it? This is the southern resident killer whale, isn't it? And then they say, well, thank God we're being sued. and this is law. This is what law is for. When all else fails, when justice is being lost, that is what we need to be able to depend on our legal system for. The work that Amy, that Yvonne, that in your way with both finance and conservation, IUCN has also been leading, is part of that struggle. And it's a very, very important struggle. Perhaps one of the most important ones that we face, as Jorge Cabrera mentioned this morning, and as Christina Loy also underlined from the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. we may reach a point where we can actually turn to technology, finance, all of the efforts and prevent our emissions from changing the climate beyond something that we can live in. But if we turn around and realize that we've taken all other species with us, there is a matter of justice there that will be impossible to explain to those seventh generations that you referred to in the opening. So thank you to all of our panelists. We have Adwoa Appiah in the Balsillie School Node, who is moderating this panel. And I want to just go to her briefly online to see if there are questions from our online audience. We have over 400 registrants, as you know. They've been following different sessions, as one does when one is in one's living room, depending on their choices. And then the recordings and materials go to all of them. So I would like to ask if Adwoa would like to briefly tell us if there are any questions online.
Thank you very much, Claire. There are actually no questions online at the moment, but I know that we have two questions from the audience sitting with you in the central node. So maybe they can raise their hands and they can be called upon to ask their question.
Wonderful. We have two questions. I will turn first to our colleague and then to Eva. Yes.
Yeah, so I'll be very brief. So I'm from Cameroon, but I spent most of my life in capital markets and also the energy and infrastructure industry. I did some negotiations on behalf of the African government, really difficult. And I worked most of my on pro bono in West Africa. So I've seen the beast from each side, and I just wanted to know, how do you think you will address the issue of governance? Because what you know, we have mineral, we have oil and gas, and we now have carbon under Article 6. It's just turned into some sovereign issue, and then biodiversity will become the same. So I just wanted to know if this is high on your agenda, and how do you ensure that this, we're not going to drift into something that will be hijacked by you know, administrations in most of the world, really.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Eva, we'll collect a few and then we'll come back to our panels and at the back as well. Go ahead, please.
I think my question is a little more philosophical in a sense, where we have a climate emergency as well as a biological emergency at the same time, which we've been acknowledging throughout COP15. However, at the same time, in order to keep trade accountable, in order to keep businesses accountable, as well as our legal obligations accountable, how do we ensure that we are progressing along this biological framework in a way where we have the urgency, yet still keep accountable to the land and the people around it? Since a lot of the literature that we're looking at, in a sense, is ironically called white literature, i.e. scientific literature, whereas Indigenous literature is treated more as gray knowledge, whereas at the same time, we're seeing Indigenous people who are saying the resources that are necessary to trade and power our green transition in a form as green colonialism, where it's killing our sockeye salmon, taking away the caribou habitats that are in northern Quebec and around the circumpolar north. And I hear a lot of youth who have been participating saying that we need a more holistic evaluation of this framework. Yeah, I know many of our panelists say that we need key metrics, we need all of this in an annex and lists of protected species, but how do we take into consideration this ecosystem network of factors that contribute to biodiversity loss that isn't necessarily saying like, oh, we have like certain types of animals being traded, like the earrings that I wear today made by my friend, such as mammoth or walrus, but take it in holistically to keep accountable to the natural resources that go into our transition and the protection of our biodiversity at the same time.
That's a wonderful question. And the question of how a treaty has evolved and changed to take into account and indeed to center on an understanding of ecosystems and connectivity is going to have to be part of our discussion here. We have another one just behind you, and then I see somebody at the very back.
Hi, thank you. I'm just curious, Dr. Cabrera and Mr. Hardcastle, sorry. You guys were mentioning finance. I'm just kind of curious, and apologies if this is a bit naive, but is there going to be like a multilateral fund or something in the GBF that will help so that countries can actually afford to conserve and be rewarded for actually protecting nature?
Wonderful. And we'll collect one last question from the back here.
Hi, my name is Alexander. I'm actually a lawyer. So it was the intersection of genomics and biomonitoring. Like what Yvonne was saying, we lack a biomonitoring tool. What we do is we scan the air for environmental DNA. And this has been just proven this year that we can do that. And so that could be a way of tracking, services like a threatened species that is being traded to go forth. We can actually scan it for and know whether that's, the DNA of that species is left in the air. It can also be used for migratory birds. So the question is, I want to double click on data because I think how can we be accountable, for claims from governments and corporates if we don't have data, that we don't have data on biodiversity, we just assume. And so the question is for all of the panelists is what is the data that we need? And what's if you had a magic wand, what data do we have?
An entrepreneur asking what data is needed and what data would be the absolute top ideal, which is an excellent question. And if you hadn't admitted you were an entrepreneur, we would have guessed it by the end. So thank you very, very much. And I'm just going to come back to Adwoa online. Do we have other questions? I want to make sure we don't lose them because then I'm going to turn back to the keynotes and ask them if they'd like to choose among the questions and answer. And hopefully we will be able to, they can self-regulate to ensure that all of the questions have been answered. Adwoa, do we have any that are online that we should respond to? Or any in your node in Balsillie School? And Marcus, if you would like to put forward one to Adwoa from Cambridge, or if any of our colleagues from Dhaka, from Kinshasa, from San Jose would like to do so, that would be very welcome. You might be muted, Adwoa.
Oh, okay. Thank you. None at the moment. So maybe we can start off with the questions that have come up so far. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. In that case, I'm going to turn back to our keynotes and give them a moment or two to answer each of the questions. I'm going to start with Amy and then go to Yvonne, if she doesn't mind, and then come down to James.
Okay, sure. I'll start with the fund because that one's easy. That's a topic of great negotiation right now, so we don't know how it's going to come out. There's been it's a major sticking point for the negotiations, so we'll see. There have been costings of what it would take to implement the CBD and the previous frameworks, and I think there have also been calculations on that. And there's a lot of finance discussion going on actually, which is helpful. And I'm very interested, by the way, in the bond discussions. Okay, I think I'm going to take the first and the fourth questions together because I think they kind of fit well, which is this first question about the very, let's say, conventional ways that governments prioritize, or our society is prioritizing the different sectors. And as I said earlier, when we talk about a trade deal, that tends to be binding, enforceable, or contract in a private setting. So clearly, petroleum, mining, I know when some of the situations around the current situation with Ukraine and the energy issues that resulted in have also led some countries to soften their enforcement of national laws related to migratory species because they're rushing to put windmills in, and they need to do it not necessarily according to best practice. So you see again and again, the underlining of or underscoring of these priorities, while the sustainable development goals, of course, are supposed to lead us to a place where the economic, social, and environment are all reinforcing each other. So one thing that would help is data. And on the data side, I would say efforts to quantify value services. If we are getting rid of ecosystems, what does that actually mean in economic terms? And there's a lot of work going on around that. I know for some that's not a preferred way of doing things, but if we're going to speak to businesses in their language and their accounting sheets, I think that's in that framework, it's helpful. It's not helpful for everything that we do in this work. We also need, for species work, we have a huge deficit of knowledge of the status of the species at really the local level, population level. It's expensive. Some countries do it. We just heard actually Mexico is doing amazing work, for example, in monitoring the numbers of different species and changes over time, but it's not happening everywhere. It's hard and expensive. A third would also be the level of exploitation. Like, we don't really know how much is there, how many species are being taken, and how does that affect the well-being, the viability of the population. I want to also touch on the second question, which was about the crises and white knowledge and gray knowledge. I think it's a very astute observation. And I think I'll say, maybe a little controversial to say this, but, the colonial framework has brought us to where we are, and the colonial framework is what's being negotiated to solve those problems, So if we want to look outside, I'll give you one example, which some of you have heard me talk about, which is about connectivity, okay? And the conservation model that, and many African countries I know have been speaking loudly about this, saying the colonial model is we protect these areas. This is where the animals are. And then the people are supposed to be over here in the cities. And we know that's not how nature works. And nature is everywhere. And nature is in cities. We're in a city. There are hawks out there. There are whales that have come up the St. Lawrence River, I know, so it's so there's a real voice coming forward of, we have to rethink this and think about how do we have our landscapes, modeled in a way now that account for people and animals and nature, and protecting sort of corridors or networks of areas where it makes sense, and doing what we can also in our cities to have green space. And so it's not here and here, it's a more holistic approach. So that is something that's actually, I think, taking hold very strongly, and I'm very optimistic about ecological connectivity now being very clearly part of this new framework.
Thank you. And I'll turn to our other two colleagues on the panel.
Well, I think probably the financing first, and I know I'm going into your area, but I think you mentioned this bond, and we know, for example, that right now there is a rhino bond in 2 protected areas in South Africa that the Global Environment Facility and the World Bank have worked on together. Again, with the local communities living there, with performance indicators and all the rest. And we need a lot more work in this area, because what the donors are saying is that there's not going to be another fund created, and that there's money there to be used already. They're investing in Global Environment Facility and others. However, we have found it hard as CITES, because the Global Environment Facility is the financial mechanism for CBD, the Certification Convention, and the Climate Change Convention, but not for CITES. Now, the hope is that we will be able, we have heard from the CEO of the Global Environment Facility, that now with this framework that we're trying to make it for all conventions, for all, and not only CBD, that there will be ways to have access to that funding to do more work with other biodiversity related conventions. So there's that hope. But I do think we are going to have to work much more with private financing. We have to look at blended finance. We have to look at private investors, and we have to look at industry. At least the CITES, industry is benefiting from the wildlife trade. They should be investing in conserving that wildlife, because it's a business for them. That business wouldn't exist if we don't have wildlife. Why are they not investing more? So we have to find ways in which we can access better finance. In terms of how do we see this in terms of governance and who's going to be in charge, and I think this is the question, and this is why we're saying that it has to be a global biodiversity framework for all, because the governance is going to come, in my view, from our point of view, from what's happening in the different biodiversity related conventions. Our convention, our COP, our Conference of the Parties, just ended in Panama City a couple of weeks ago, and there were 365 decisions related to wildlife, plus the 48 listings of species into the appendices, the governance will continue. This will continue within each of the biodiversity related conventions. So we're hoping that as we take some of those targets on board to be our own, we will be able to see that the decision making will continue. But definitely, political will is absolutely necessary. I think this is where I'm concerned in these negotiations. Do you really want a global biodiversity framework? Are you really committed to doing something more, to have ambitious targets to make this work? And this is where we get a little bit, pessimistic, but I still feel optimistic that if we are all working together, if the work that's continuing under these different conventions, other stakeholders are involved, and I think this is another aspect of this framework. We have been forgetting other stakeholders who have a role to play. We need to bring them on board and make sure that they play out that role that they have as stakeholders. So that's my hope in terms of that. Trying to remember what we did, some of the other questions.
You've answered the one.
I think I mentioned the one waiting to answer. Okay, so I think if I can think of something else, I'll let you know. But I think those were the most important parts about the GBF in particular. Oh, the indicators and monitoring. It was about monitoring the data. Absolutely. I mean, we have a legal trade database, but it's not 100% reliable that everything is in there. There's other issues, like for example, with illegal trade of pangolins, let's say as an example. What you're saying makes me think about this. Pangolins, when they do seizures of pangolin scales, but it's very difficult to know, and there's some studies being carried out right now, is how many pangolins have died for that quantity of scales that have been seized. And so this kind of data to know really the population status, as Amy has mentioned, is sometimes very difficult with seizures. When you see meat of sharks, for example, it's hard to know. That kind of data, population status and how much is really being exploited is a difficult one. And I think that's where we are going to have to use technology to be able to get better estimates of what's really being traded and overexploited. And especially in some ecosystems like marine ecosystems, where it's very difficult.
Yeah, Yvonne is completely right. We've just finished a book for Cambridge University Press that treats endangered species as an exercise, as a commodity that is going from the community where it's taken all the way through many criminal transactions to the consumer on the end, and then looks at every single point where the law could catch it and change it. And what we find, of course, is that in most cases, for most species, it's actually all those points where there's a legal obligation to have that data, and even so, the data is so weak. So I think there's a great deal that could be done there.
That traceability is in that target.
Yeah. James, a couple of last words.
Sure.
They haven't left you too many unanswered questions.
No, it's okay. It's a couple of bits. 3 tons. I remember 3 tons of pangolins being seized in Vietnam. 3 tons. And it sounds, it's a number, it's a metric. No, it's data. 3 tons. But when you actually see 3 tons of pangolins filling a room like this, just of these, I mean, it really hits you. It's like, wow. And each one of those is wild, hunted, harvested, collected. So nothing inherently wrong with harvesting, but it's quite a shocking image. That's all I have. Just quickly, a couple of the comments maybe that we're missing. I really liked your points on the urgency, but then we need the accountability, and things are slow. I think youth definitely. It's just it's a different youth. The future's not what it used to be. It's really kind of a bit more urgent, certainly with the youth movement, and we need to be doing all we can to make that happen and bring young voices to the fore. For me, it comes back again to this idea of effectiveness and how can, again, areas that are set aside or dedicated or always have been dedicated for nature conservation, how can we recognize them when they're being effective, and what is the data and what are the metric, what are the kind of the things that we need for that? And it doesn't have to be hard science, eDNA, something that's scientifically verified. There's so many other ways to do that. And I think what it comes back down to for us is, it's about the governance. It's about who decides what are the important values in an area. And those people are the ones who count. When we talk about 30% or 30 by 30, it's about who counts, not what counts. And it's those voices being able to bring them to the table so they decide what are the important values. Is it pangolins? Is it the salmon? Is it the river itself? Is it just the sense of being in the landscape? what are the values? And based on those values, what are the important things that need to be measured? What does success look like for those values? And if you can capture that and turn that into a metric, and you can verify that and you can report that, then you can bring some, some investment, some resources, some support for the conservation of those values. And that's where you can link it to the financing. And it's this, again, it's just back down to the governance mechanisms that we need to get away from the capture. I think that the point was there. That it is not just one sector that kind of gets this, it gets all the resources, it gets the financing, and then decides what projects or where the financing is going. It needs to be much more about enabling the resourcing to these different governance entities in areas, in important places for the important values that they have.
Perfect, thank you. So we are going to close with a very special announcement that many of us have been looking forward to all day, since we preempted it for one of the awards. And this is, of course, the inaugural Global Leadership Award for Biodiversity Law and Governance. I discovered recently that one of the awardees didn't actually know she had been nominated by so many of her colleagues. So there's a bit of a surprise element to some of this. And what I would like to do is one colleague who has, she's unable to be here with us because she's actually chairing the forum for which she was granted the award. So I think that's probably very common. And she has designated a colleague and friend of hers to accept the award on her behalf. I will simply stand up and make the announcement, place where the laureates can come and join me. There will be some special photographs afterwards as well. And in particular, I always love these particular moments because our community is not good enough at recognizing effort and recognizing dedication and recognizing years often of very hard work that leads to winning one of these awards. So my first announcement, I'll start with the person who a colleague has agreed to accept on her behalf, is the winner of the inaugural 2022 Global Leadership Award in Biodiversity Law and Governance, Viviana Elsa Figueroa. She's part of the Convention on Biological Diversity Community, focus on traditional knowledge, innovations and practice, mainstreaming, partnerships and outreach. She holds an Argentine law degree and is leader in the indigenous organization Asociación de la Juventud Indígena Argentina. So she started as a youth leader in this area, youth indigenous leader, where she conducted work on traditional knowledge and has been involved in traditional knowledge capacity building. She's also, of course, been deeply involved with the indigenous peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean region through the Indigenous Women's Network on Biodiversity for Latin America. And she's being recognized in particular, obviously with a focus on Article 8J and related provisions of the CBD. She's being recognized for her legal and governance leadership with Indigenous women and youth for biodiversity across Latin America and the world. So I'm going to take the award here, and if Professor Constantia Kutuki, who was one of
filming this for her,
could come and accept the award on her behalf and take a photograph that will go to her in her indigenous community.
There we go.
There we are. Well,
Thank you so much, and I will see her later this week and actually later today.
Oh, good.
Wonderful. We're going to see if we can do a photograph with her on a suitable COP15 background with some of the members of the jury. Now, the second award that I would like to give is actually for someone whose background is in human rights and humanitarian work, particularly conflict in one of the world's most megadiverse countries. And she has stood up for human rights. She has stood up for the law and justice. She has worked with the International Committee on the Red Cross. She has served on many delegations of international human rights and other bodies. And she is, of course, also a leader of the legal community, not just in her country, but worldwide. And I would like to, probably no surprise now that I've described the individual in question, invite the president of the International Law Association of Colombia, Maria, if you could come to receive your. Take the biodiversity emergency with the seriousness that it deserves. This is the biggest conflict of all time, my friend, and we need your expertise. And this is a past, present, and future effort award. Thank you. And you can stay here with Conchetta as well. Now, the third award is for someone who is well known for her work over the decades on the Sustainable Development Goals and the contributions of biodiversity in those awards, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, in the United Nations Environment Programme's North American office, and also, of course, now as Executive Secretary of the Convention on Migratory Species. So I'm very, very honored to present this award to Amy Fraenkel, a lawyer and a biodiversity. Amy was nominated over 2 years ago for this award, and we've been waiting through COVID to be able to finally give it to her. So, well, thank you as well. We will do a couple of photos. I think our photographer is behind us. If you're going to have to.
I need a.
Oh, there we are. Inge has stepped forward as well.
I need a step in for the step in.
Thank you.
I got to say, Viviana used to work with me on Article 8J when I was at CBD, so I'm so thrilled to share it with her. And is it Maria?
Yeah. Come on out.
Nice to meet you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And of course, with the big expensive camera, you have to have the backup of the iPhone.
Okay. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We have a final speaker who agreed to join us, quite appropriately, a law student, who is also editor-in-chief of the McGill Journal of Sustainable Development Law, that are among our hosts today. I think I will ask Yasin if you can come down and just say a few words of closure, and then I have a few thank yous. So, do you want me to start my thank yous, Yasin?
It's up to you.
Or would you like to go first?
I can go.
Yeah.
Shall we go to the audience?
I can put a speak up here. Yes, so hi everyone. My name is Yasin Ervazhnik. I'm a third-year student here at McGill University Faculty of Law. I'm representing the McGill Journal of Sustainable Development Law, reportedly as editor-in-chief, as Professor Cordonier and Segger mentioned. The MJSDL is a bilingual, student-run and peer-reviewed academic journal here at the law faculty. We are one of the few environmental law journals in Canada and a proud partner of the Center for International Sustainable Development Law in its work. And I want to thank the Center for International Sustainable Development Law for its excellent role that it's been playing as a catalyst for developing groundbreaking legal scholarship, of which we are in desperate need. As we know, the stakes in the biodiversity loss crisis have never been higher. Some scientists estimate that we may lose 40% of all species by the end of this century, which would drastically undermine the ecosystem services that we depend upon as humanity, and fundamentally alter the biosphere, whose diversity should be maintained as an end in of itself. So now is the time that we should recognize that humanity is one of many global inhabitants and build responsive and effective governance systems to respect planetary boundaries. So we're fortunate to be able to gather here today in Montreal, which is a place of traditional meeting and exchange. McGill University is located on traditional and unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee Nation. I believe we must reflect on this dispossession and the continuing legacy of colonialism throughout the world, Indigenous peoples, Canada, and across the world. And it's crucial for us to elevate Indigenous voices as we combat this anthropogenic mass extinction that we're facing now, And it's for that reason that I'm particularly grateful that among the many topics that we discussed here today, we have looked at biodiversity issues through the lens of Indigenous law and treaty. Lastly, as a student and future, I hope, practitioner of sustainable development law, events like today's Biodiversity Law and Governance Day that unite academics, practitioners, international experts, and delegates are formative. Today's panels, roundtables, and keynote speakers inspire hope in me that my peers and I can build upon the collective wisdom and progress achieved by this community and continue to make strides towards a more just and ecologically sensitive law, both internationally and domestically, in our future careers. So for this reason, again, I want to thank today's speakers, the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, its partners, and all of our attendees. On behalf of our journal, students here at the McGill University Faculty of Law, I applaud you for your advocacy in this important domain and for your contributions to the discourse. I'm eager to continue engaging in this dialogue with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasin, and thank you for the work of your journal, which continues to inspire us all. Among us, I'm sure, are future submitters of articles and also future reviewers of articles when you call. What I think also deserves to be said, of course, and it will be no surprise, is that Yasin is one of several student leaders who have come forward and taken up an incredible role in the organization of this event. So I want to especially thank the lawyers and student leaders online in the nodes that have been with us for the whole day, for some of whom I believe it is now 1 o'clock in the morning. I'd like to especially thank Hafiz Khan in Dhaka in Bangladesh, who has been leading his node. I'd like to thank Eric Kasongo in Kinshasa as well, a lawyer, barefoot lawyer working in the forests of the Congo Basin. I'd like to especially thank as well Marcus Giering, who is a professor at the University of Cambridge and has been hosting the node there all day, as well as Adwoa Appiah, a doctoral student in Balsillie School of International Affairs and the University of Waterloo, who has been hosting their node. And I would like to especially thank my co-chair and Professor Jorge Cabrera with the node that he has been hosting in Costa Rica in San Jose. Thank you to all of them online. Also online, quiet but equally important, have been our moderators. You have seen some of them working so hard to help keep things together for us here today. Eva, especially, and Ignacio, as well as Lydia, and earlier today, Victoria and Camille and Sophia from the McGill Faculty of Law, from the University of Victoria Faculty of Law, from the other law faculties and the Universidad de Chile, who have come together to help make this event possible. Together with 2 students from the University of Cambridge, who have been only existing as voices online, Tejas, who is also manager of the CISDL and finishing his PhD in Cambridge, and Freedom Kai Phillips, who's operations director of the CISDL, and soon to be a postdoc in Cambridge and Waterloo. They have been invaluable all the way throughout, coping with every problem that came up as it came up. And finally, I would like to also especially thank Fausa Tijeri Mekauche at Yale University, who has been helping all the way through, along with Susan Ann Samuel at the University of Leeds. So it's been a really marvelous team that have made this day possible, and I hope that they will stay with us. I hope they will walk through all of the doors that have been opened for them here, and that they will be feeling confident that they can call, whether it's the leader of the International Intertribal Trade Investment Organization, or whether it's Secretary General of CITES or the CMS, and find out what more they can do to get involved in this area. We certainly need you. We need all of you, and we need thousands more like you, and that will be part of our work here. Thank you. And I now declare Biodiversity Law and Governance Day closed.
Can you switch it like a list?